When my ungrateful children decided I was too much of a burden for their perfect lives, they dumped me in Willowbrook Manor like yesterday's trash. What they didn't know was that I had just closed a business deal worth $12 million the week before. The next day, I bought their precious nursing home and became their worst nightmare, their new landlord. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Beatrice Calloway, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I'd be telling you about the day my own flesh and blood decided I was nothing more than an inconvenience to be warehoused away, but here I am, ready to share the most satisfying revenge story you'll hear all year. It started on a Thursday morning in October when I was in my kitchen making my famous apple cinnamon scones, the same recipe I'd used to comfort my children through scraped knees, broken hearts, and failed exams for over 4 decades. The doorbell rang, and I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron, expecting maybe a package delivery or a neighbor dropping by. Instead, I opened the door to find all 3 of my children standing on my porch with expressions I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, guilty. There was Diane, my eldest at 43, a cardiac surgeon who'd built her entire identity around saving lives, yet couldn't find time to save her relationship with her own mother. Behind her stood Nathan, 40, a corporate attorney who'd learned to argue so well he could convince himself that abandoning family was actually an act of love. And finally, Camille, my baby, at 37, a financial planner who could calculate the cost of everything except the value of the womanhood raised her. "Mom," Diane said, her voice carrying that artificially warm tone she used with difficult patience, "we need to discuss your living situation." I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. These were the children I'd sacrificed everything for. After their father walked out when Camille was only 3, I'd worked 3 jobs to keep them in good schools, sold my grandmother's jewelry to pay for Diane's medical school, took out a second mortgage to fund Nathan's law degree, and gave Camille my entire retirement savings to start her financial planning business. We settled in my living room, the same room where I'd nursed them through chickenpox, helped with calculus homework that made my head spin, and celebrated every graduation, promotion, and achievement they'd ever earned. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the family photos that covered every surface. Pictures of birthday parties I'd planned alone, Christmas mornings I'd made magical on a shoestring budget, and proud moments where I stood beaming behind my successful children. "Mom," Nathan began, straightening his expensive tie, "we've been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to consider some changes." My situation, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than their mother who'd given them everything. "What kind of changes, dear?" I asked, though my heart was already breaking because I could see where this was heading. Camille pulled out a glossy brochure with practiced efficiency. "We've found this wonderful facility, Willowbrook Manor. It's only 30 minutes from downtown, and they have amazing amenities." She handed me the brochure, and I felt my hands tremble as I looked at the staged photos of smiling elderly people playing bingo and eating in a sterile cafeteria. The words, "Golden Years Community," were splashed across the front in cheerful purple letters that felt like a slap in the face. "We've already toured it," Diane added, her medical voice taking over. "The staff is excellent, and you'd have your own apartment. Plus, there would be medical care on site if anything happened." If anything happened. They were already planning for my decline, my death, my disappearance from their busy lives. "I see," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "And when exactly did you decide this was what I needed?" Nathan shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, you're 68 now. Living alone in this big house isn't safe anymore. We worry about you." Worry about me? When was the last time any of them had called just to check in?
When was the last time they'd visited without wanting something? Besides, Camille added, checking her smartwatch, this house is way too much for you to maintain. The market's really strong right now. I could list it and probably get top dollar. That money could cover your care costs for years.
And there it was. They wanted to sell my home. The home I'd fought to keep after their father abandoned us. The home where I'd created every happy memory they had. The home that represented everything I'd built from nothing. To pay for the prison they were sentencing me to. The conversation continued for 2 painful hours. They had it all figured out. The deposit was already paid at Willowbrook Manor. They had appointments scheduled for me to meet with the director next week. They'd calculated the finances down to the penny. My entire future had been decided in family meetings I wasn't invited to. Discussions that happened behind my back while I waited by the phone hoping one of them might call. Fine, I finally said, my voice hollow with defeat. If this is what you've all decided, then I suppose I don't have much choice. The relief on their faces was immediate and unmistakable. They'd expected a fight, tears, pleading. Instead, their mother had simply rolled over and accepted her fate like a good little old lady who knew her place. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that just 1 week earlier, I'd received a call that would change everything. The call that would transform me from their discarded burden into their worst nightmare. You see, for the past 15 years, I'd been quietly running a small consulting business for my home office. Nothing flashy, nothing that would impress my high-achieving children, but steady work helping small businesses optimize their operations. My clients were loyal, and word of mouth had built me a solid reputation in the business community. That Tuesday before their surprise visit, I'd received an offer I couldn't resist. TechFlow Industries, a growing company I'd been consulting with for 3 years, wanted to buy my entire client list, my proprietary systems, and my ongoing consultation contract. The offer was $12.5 million in cash, with closing scheduled for Friday. My children had no idea about any of this. To them, I was just their helpless old mother who needed to be managed and contained. They saw the modest house, the simple lifestyle, the woman who had always put everyone else's needs before her own. They never bothered to ask about my work, my achievements, or my financial situation. As they packed up their victory and prepared to leave that Thursday afternoon, Nathan paused at the door. "We'll be back on Saturday to help you start packing, Mom. This is really for the best." For the best. For whose best, I wondered. After they left, I sat in my empty living room and made a decision that would change all of our lives forever. I picked up my phone and called my business attorney. "Richard," I said when he answered, "remember that conversation we had about investment opportunities? I think I'd like to explore the healthcare sector." By Friday evening, I was $12.5 million richer and absolutely furious. But I wasn't going to let anger drive my decisions. I was going to let strategy guide my revenge. Saturday morning came, and my children arrived with boxes and packing tape, ready to dismantle my life with the same efficiency they brought to their professional endeavors. I watched them work, cataloging my belongings like an estate sale, deciding what was worth keeping and what should be donated. "This can come with you," Diane said, holding up a single family photo, "but this piano will have to go." She gestured dismissively at the upright piano I'd played every evening for 40 years, the one I'd bought used and refinished myself, the one that had provided the soundtrack to their childhood. I said very little during those horrible hours. I signed the papers they put in front of me. I nodded when they explained their timeline. But inside, I was planning. On Sunday, they drove me to Willowbrook Manor in Diane's luxury SUV. I sat in the passenger seat, watching my neighborhood disappear in the side mirror, the same streets where I'd pushed their strollers, taught them to ride bikes, and walked them to school every day for years. Willowbrook Manor was exactly as depressing as I'd expected. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of institutional food and human resignation.
My apartment was a single room, barely larger than a closet, with a window that looked out onto the parking lot instead of the garden I'd tended for decades. The staff was polite but rushed, with the harried look of people trying to do too much with too little time. They had 15 minutes to show me around, explain the meal schedule, and orient me to my new reality. "I think this is going to be wonderful for you, Mom," Diane said, but she was already checking her phone for messages from the hospital. "We'll visit soon," Nathan promised, though his definition of soon would prove to be very different from mine. "You're going to love it here," Camille added, backing towards the door like she couldn't wait to escape.
And then they left, all three of them walking out of that sterile room and out of my life with the same casual indifference they'd shown when they'd decided to put me there. I listened to their cars start in the parking lot below, listened to the sound of their engines fading into the distance, and then I sat on the narrow institutional bed and allowed myself exactly 10 minutes to grieve the children I'd lost and the life I'd been forced to leave behind. Then I dried my tears, straightened my shoulders, and reached for my phone. It was time to make some calls. Time to turn the tables. Time to show my children that they'd made the biggest mistake of their lives. Because tomorrow, everything was going to change. And they had absolutely no idea what was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Let me tell you exactly who Beatrice Calloway was before my children decided I was disposable. Because understanding my story, my real story, is crucial to appreciating just how spectacularly they miscalculated. I wasn't born into wealth or privilege. I grew up in a cramped apartment above Murphy's hardware store on Elm Street, the daughter of Irish immigrants who believed that hard work and education could overcome any obstacle. My father, Patrick O'Brien, worked 16-hour days in the steel mills, while my mother, Rose, cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs. They saved every penny to send me to Sacred Heart Academy, where the nuns taught me that intelligence without character was worthless, but intelligence with determination could move mountains. I met James Calloway at the public library when I was 22. He was studying for his engineering degree while working nights at the docks to pay for school. I was there researching small business management techniques, already dreaming of the consulting company I wanted to build. We spent 3 hours that first evening discussing efficiency systems and workflow optimization, and I knew I'd found someone who understood that success wasn't handed to you, it was earned through strategic thinking and relentless effort. We married 2 years later in a ceremony that cost less than most people spend on a dinner date. My dress was borrowed, the flowers came from my mother's garden, and the reception was held in the church basement with food prepared by family members. But it was perfect because it was ours, built on love and shared dreams rather than family money or social expectations. James and I bought our first house, a small 2-bedroom fixer-upper on Maple Avenue, with a down payment we'd saved working double shifts and skipping luxuries for 3 years. Every weekend, we painted walls, refinished floors, and planted the garden that would become my sanctuary. That house wasn't just our home, it was proof that 2 people with more ambition than resources could build something beautiful together. When Diane was born in 1981, I was working part-time as a bookkeeper, while James designed water treatment systems for municipal governments. Money was tight, but we were happy. I kept detailed budgets in composition notebooks, clipping coupons and shopping sales, making every dollar stretch to cover diapers, formula, and the growing needs of our expanding family. Nathan arrived 2 years later, followed by Camille in 1987. By then, I'd started taking on small consulting projects from home, helping local businesses streamline their operations, optimize their inventory systems, and improve their customer service protocols. I'd work during nap times and after bedtime, building my reputation one satisfied client at a time. The real test came in 1990, when James decided that being a father and husband was too much responsibility for his free spirit. I came home from a client meeting to find a note on the kitchen table. "I need to find myself. The kids will be better off without me dragging them down.
Don't try to contact me. Just like that, I became a single mother of 3 children under the age of 9, with a mortgage, car payments, and dreams that suddenly felt impossible. But giving up wasn't in my vocabulary. My children needed stability, education, and opportunities, and I was going to provide all 3 even if it killed me. I turned my part-time consulting into a full-time business overnight. I took on every project I could find, working with hardware stores, restaurants, small manufacturing companies, and service businesses throughout the region. My specialty became operational efficiency, finding ways to reduce waste, improve workflows, and increase profitability without major capital investments. During the day, I was mom. I packed lunches, helped with homework, attended every school play and soccer game. I taught Diane how to suture wounds using old dolls when she announced she wanted to be a doctor. I spent hours helping Nathan practice his debate techniques when he discovered his talent for argument. I worked with Camille on math problems and business concepts when she showed an early interest in finance.
But at night, after they were asleep, I became Beatrice Calloway, business consultant. I'd sit at my kitchen table with client files spread around me, developing solutions to complex operational problems. I charged reasonable rates because I understood what it was like to struggle, but my results were exceptional. Word spread through the business community that Beatrice Calloway could solve problems that bigger consulting firms couldn't touch. The sacrifices were real and constant. I wore the same 3 business outfits for 5 years, rotating them carefully and maintaining them meticulously. I drove a used Honda with 180,000 miles because reliable transportation mattered more than appearances. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so my children could have balanced meals with fresh vegetables and lean protein. When Diane needed money for medical school applications, I sold my grandmother's engagement ring, the only valuable jewelry I owned. When Nathan required expensive prep courses for the LSAT, I took out a loan against my business equipment. When Camille wanted to attend a summer business program for high school students, I worked an extra 20 hours a week for 3 months to cover the costs. But I never complained, never made them feel guilty for needing things, never let them see me cry from exhaustion or worry. They were my children, my legacy, my reason for getting up every morning and fighting for a better future. My business grew steadily through the 1990s and 2000s. I developed a reputation for solving impossible problems, helping family restaurants survive economic downturns, streamlining operations for growing manufacturing companies, and optimizing supply chains for regional distributors. My client retention rate was 94% because I didn't just provide solutions, I provided results. By 2010, I was earning more money than I'd ever imagined possible, but you'd never know it from my lifestyle. I still lived in the same house on Maple Avenue, still drove modest cars, still shopped at discount stores. The difference was that now I was saving and investing rather than scraping to survive. I opened college funds for my future grandchildren, established an emergency fund that could cover any crisis, and built a portfolio of conservative investments that grew steadily year after year. My children knew I worked in consulting, but they assumed it was small-scale, local work that barely paid the bills. They never asked about my clients, never showed interest in my business strategies, never inquired about my financial situation. To them, I was just mom, the woman who'd always been there, who'd always made things work somehow, who could be counted on to solve problems without expecting recognition or gratitude. When they graduated from their prestigious programs and launched their successful careers, I was so proud I could barely contain myself. Dr. Diane Calloway, saving lives at Metropolitan General Hospital. Attorney Nathan Calloway, making partner at Stewart & Associates. Camille Calloway, CFP, building her own financial planning practice. They were everything I dreamed they could become. But somewhere along the way, they forgot where they came from. They forgot the woman who'd sacrificed everything to make their success possible.
They forgot that intelligence, determination, and strategic thinking don't disappear just because someone turns 68. They saw my modest lifestyle and assumed I was struggling financially. They saw my quiet demeanor and assumed I was helpless. They saw my willingness to put their needs first and assumed I had no needs of my own. They confused selflessness with weakness, generosity with desperation. What they didn't know was that Beatrice Calloway Consulting had become one of the most respected efficiency firms in the tri-state area. What they didn't understand was that my quiet lifestyle was a choice, not a limitation. What they couldn't imagine was that their helpless mother had spent decades building something they'd never bothered to ask about. They knew I'd raised 3 successful children as a single mother while building a business from nothing. They knew I'd overcome poverty, abandonment, and countless obstacles through sheer determination. They knew I'd solved complex problems for hundreds of businesses over the course of my career. But somehow, they convinced themselves that this same woman couldn't handle living independently at 68. They decided that the person who'd managed their entire lives, their educations, and their opportunities was suddenly incompetent to manage her own affairs. As I sat in that sterile room at Willowbrook Manor on Sunday night, listening to the sounds of forgotten people shuffling through hallways, I thought about everything I'd built and everything I'd given. I thought about the business I'd created, the reputation I'd earned, and the respect I'd commanded in professional circles they knew nothing about. I thought about the $12.5 million sitting in my bank account, money I'd earned through intelligence, hard work, and strategic thinking. Money that represented 30 years of solving other people's problems, optimizing their operations, and building their success. And I realized that it was time to solve one more problem. It was time to optimize one more operation. It was time to build one more success story.
Except this time, the problem was my ungrateful children. The operation was Willowbrook Manor, and the success story was going to be the greatest business acquisition of my career. Because if there was one thing Beatrice Calloway knew how to do, it was take a broken system and make it work exactly the way it should. And starting tomorrow, my children were about to learn that they just made the biggest miscalculation of their lives. Monday morning arrived with the weight of institutional routine pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. At 6:30 a.m. sharp, a care aide knocked on my door to remind me about breakfast in the communal dining room. The woman, whose name tag read Patty, couldn't have been older than 25, and she spoke to me with a patronizing tone reserved for children and the mentally impaired. "Good morning, Mrs. Calloway. Time to get up and start our day. Did we sleep well?" We, as if my sleep patterns had somehow become a collective experience. The dining hall was a study in human warehousing. Rows of round tables accommodated residents who sat in assigned seats, eating from divided plastic trays that reminded me of school lunch programs. The food was institutional bland, overcooked eggs, soggy toast, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the previous decade. But what struck me most was the silence. 37 elderly people eating breakfast together, and the only sounds were the clinking of plastic utensils against plastic plates and the occasional cough or sniffle. No conversations, no laughter, no human connection. Just the mechanical consumption of calories by people who'd been trained not to expect anything more from their remaining years. I sat at table 6 with 3 other women who'd been deemed suitable companions based on some mysterious algorithm the staff used to assign seating. There was Dorothy, a former librarian whose daughter lived in Seattle and visited twice a year. Agnes, a retired teacher whose son was too busy with his practice to call regularly.
and Helen, whose family had stopped visiting entirely after she'd developed mild dementia and become difficult to manage. As I listened to their stories over those first few days, a pattern emerged that made my blood boil. These weren't women who'd failed at life or neglected their families. Dorothy had raised 4 children after her husband died in Vietnam, working 2 jobs to put them all through college. Agnes had taught elementary school for 43 years, inspiring thousands of children and earning Teacher of the Year awards. Helen had been a nurse who'd worked through 3 wars and countless epidemics, saving lives and comforting families in their darkest moments. Yet here they were, discarded by the very children they'd sacrificed everything to raise. Their families had convinced themselves that warehousing these remarkable women was somehow an act of love, a responsible decision that freed everyone from the inconvenience of actual caregiving. My first week at Willowbrook Manor was an education in systematic dehumanization. The staff wasn't cruel, they were simply overwhelmed and undertrained, operating within a system designed to process elderly people efficiently rather than care for them meaningfully. Residents were awakened at predetermined times, fed predetermined meals, and shuffled through predetermined activities regardless of their individual preferences or needs. The activities were particularly insulting. Bingo every Monday at 2 p.m., whether you wanted to play or not. Arts and crafts on Wednesday that consisted of coloring pre-drawn pictures like we were in kindergarten. Movie night on Friday featuring films from the 1940s, played at volumes loud enough to wake the dead, because apparently everyone over 65 was assumed to be hearing impaired. But the most devastating aspect wasn't the institutional routine, it was the visiting patterns, or rather, the complete lack thereof. I made careful mental notes during those first days, observing which residents received visitors and how often. Out of 43 people living at Willowbrook Manor, only 12 had received any visitors during my first week. 12 out of 43. The rest sat by windows or in the common areas, watching the parking lot hopefully, waiting for cars that never came. Mrs. Patterson in room 14 dressed in her best outfit every Sunday morning and sat in the lobby from 10 a.m. till 6 p.m., convinced that this would be the week her grandson remembered his promise to visit. Mr. Rodriguez had been telling everyone for 6 months that his daughter was planning a big visit for his birthday. His birthday had been 4 months ago. The excuses were always the same when family members did call, which happened rarely enough that staff members would announce it like a special event. "Mrs. Johnson, your son is on the phone." Work was too demanding, the kids had activities, traffic was terrible, something had come up. Next week would be better.
Meanwhile, my own children had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Diane called exactly once during my first week, staying on the phone for precisely 4 minutes to ask if I was settling in okay, before claiming she had to scrub in for surgery. Nathan sent a generic thinking of you card with no personal message, the kind you buy from a hospital gift shop when you're too guilty to visit but not guilty enough to actually make an effort. Camille did nothing at all. But the real education in family betrayal came when I witnessed other families in action during the few visits that did occur. I watched from the common area as adult children arrived with their own children in tow, spending exactly 1 hour going through the motions of care before making elaborate excuses about why they had to leave. The worst was young Mrs. Henderson's family visit on my second Thursday. Her daughter arrived with 2 teenagers who immediately pulled out their phones and sat in the corner, making it clear they'd been dragged along against their will. The daughter spent most of the visit discussing her mother's condition with staff members, as if Mrs. Henderson wasn't sitting right there, perfectly capable of speaking for herself. "How has she been eating?" the daughter asked the nurse, while her mother sat 3 feet away. "Has she been taking her medications?" Another question directed at staff rather than the woman whose life they were discussing. "Is she making friends? as if friendship was a prescribed activity rather than a natural human need. The entire conversation happened around Mrs. Henderson, not with her. When the daughter finally did address her mother directly, it was with the same tone Patty used with me, overly cheerful and slightly condescending. "How are you feeling today, Mom? Are you keeping busy? That's nice, dear." Mrs. Henderson tried several times to share stories about her week, to connect with her daughter on a human level, but each attempt was met with distracted nods and glances at the clock. After exactly 62 minutes, the daughter announced they had to leave for soccer practice. "We'll try to visit again soon, Mom," she promised, but Mrs. Henderson and I both knew what soon meant in family speak. It meant whenever guilt next overcame convenience, which could be weeks or months away. As I watched this performance of filial duty, I realized that my children hadn't just abandoned me, they'd convinced themselves that they were the victims in this situation. They'd created a narrative where policing me in Willowbrook Manor was a noble sacrifice they were making for my own good, where visiting more than absolutely necessary would somehow be enabling my dependence. Diane had perfected the art of medical rationalization. "Mom's safer there," she'd tell herself. "They have professional staff who can monitor her health better than we could." Never mind that I'd been monitoring my own health quite successfully for 68 years and had never asked for medical supervision. Nathan had constructed a legal framework for abandonment. "We're protecting Mom's interests," he'd argue. "If something happened while she was living alone, we could be held liable for not ensuring proper care." Never mind that the only thing I needed protection from was my own children's guilt-driven decision-making. Camille had developed financial justifications for warehousing me. "This is actually more cost-effective long-term," she'd calculate. "When you factor in home maintenance, utilities, and potential emergency medical costs, the facility is really the smart financial choice." Never mind that I could afford my own home maintenance and had never asked her to pay for my utilities. They'd taken the hardest decision a family can face and turned it into a business calculation, complete with spreadsheets, risk assessments, and cost-benefit analyses. They'd convinced themselves that love meant making the responsible choice rather than the choice that honored what I actually wanted. But the real insulting aspect was how they'd executed their plan. This wasn't a family crisis where difficult decisions had to be made quickly. This was a calculated intervention, planned over weeks or months while I continued to live independently, maintain my home, manage my business, and prove daily that I was perfectly capable of making my own decisions. They'd held family meetings without me, researched facilities without my input, and made deposits using money they assumed I didn't have. They'd treated me like an incompetent elderly woman whose opinions were irrelevant to decisions about her own life. The more I learned about Willowbrook Manor during that first week, the more I understood the depth of their betrayal. This wasn't one of the premium facilities with extensive amenities and personalized care. This was a mid-level operation designed to provide basic services at the lowest possible cost. They'd chosen it not because it was the best place for me, but because it was the most convenient for them. The location was 30 minutes from downtown, which meant 30 minutes from all of their offices and homes. Close enough that they could claim accessibility, far enough that visiting would require real effort and planning, the perfect distance for managing guilt without requiring genuine commitment. The cost structure was designed for families who wanted to appear responsible without making significant financial sacrifices. At $4,200 per month, it was expensive enough to feel like they were providing quality care, but not so expensive that it would impact their own lifestyles. Most revealing was the contract they'd signed on my behalf. Standard visiting hours were listed as 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. daily, which sounded generous until you realized that most working adults could only visit during evening hours or weekends. The facility offered family dining options for an additional fee, group activities that families could join for extra cost, and private meeting rooms available by reservation. Everything was structured to make family involvement feel optional rather than essential. The message was clear. Drop off your elderly relative, pay the monthly fee, and we'll handle everything else. Visit when convenient, participate when you feel like it, but don't worry about daily engagement or meaningful connection. It was a system designed by and for families who wanted to outsource the responsibility of caring for aging parents while maintaining the illusion that they were still loving, dutiful children. As I lay in my narrow bed that first Friday night, listening to the institutional sounds of forgotten people settling into another evening of isolation, I felt something crystallize inside me. This wasn't just about my children's betrayal anymore. This was about a system that enabled families to abandon their elderly relatives while feeling virtuous about it. Willowbrook Manor was profitable because it promised families an easy solution to the complex challenge of aging parents. It thrived because it allowed adult children to avoid the difficult conversations, the schedule adjustments, and the emotional labor required to keep elderly relatives integrated into family life. My children had purchased peace of mind for themselves at the cost of my dignity, my autonomy, and my right to remain connected to the family I'd spent my entire adult life building and supporting. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation in their careful planning. They'd assumed that Beatrice Calloway would quietly accept their decision and fade gracefully into institutional obscurity. They're about to learn just how wrong they were about that assumption. By my second week at Willowbrook Manor, the initial shock of abandonment had settled into something more dangerous, a cold, analytical fury that sharpened my focus rather than clouding it. I'd spent my entire career solving complex operational problems, and now I found myself living inside the biggest operational disaster I'd ever encountered. The facility operated on what I recognized as a classic, low-margin, high-volume business model designed to maximize profit while minimizing actual care. During my morning walks through the corridors, one of the few activities that didn't require staff supervision, I began conducting an informal audit of their operations. The staffing ratios were criminally inadequate. 3 certified nursing assistants were responsible for 43 residents during the day shift, dropping to just 2 CNAs and 1 LPN during evening hours. I'd optimized operations for restaurants that had better staff-to-customer ratios than this place had for vulnerable elderly people who needed assistance with basic daily functions. The kitchen operated like a prison commissary, preparing meals in bulk using the cheapest possible ingredients. I watched through the service window as staff reheated pre-processed foods in industrial microwaves, adding canned vegetables that had been drained of both nutrition and flavor. The monthly food budget, based on conversations I overheard between dietary staff, worked out to approximately $3.50 per resident per day. I'd seen dog food with higher quality standards. But the real education came from observing the financial ecosystem that kept this system profitable. Willowbrook Manor wasn't just warehousing elderly people, it was extracting maximum revenue from every aspect of their captivity. The base monthly fee of $4,200 covered what they called standard care, a shared room, 3 institutional meals per day, and basic custodial supervision. Everything else carried additional charges that families discovered only after their relatives were already installed and dependent on the facility's services. Want your mother to have her own room? Additional $800 per month. Need help with personal grooming beyond the bare minimum required by state regulations? That's $150 monthly for enhanced personal care services. Prescription medication management, which should have been included in medical oversight, was billed separately at $75 per medication per month. The activities program was essentially a fee-generating scheme disguised as enrichment. The basic schedule of bingo and coloring was included in the standard rate, but anything resembling actual engagement with life required additional payment. Music therapy sessions were $45 each. Art classes with real supplies cost $30 per session. Even family dining, the opportunity to eat a meal with your visiting relatives, carried a $25 per person surcharge. Most insidious were the incidental care charges that accumulated like hidden taxes. Need your sheets changed more than twice a week because of incontinence issues? Additional laundry fees applied. Require assistance getting to the bathroom during night hours? That triggered after-hours care billing. Want staff to help you call family members? Communication assistance would appear on next month's invoice. I began keeping detailed notes on these practices, documenting them with the same systematic approach I'd use to analyze inefficiencies for my consulting clients. The difference was that this time, the inefficiencies weren't accidental. They were designed features of a system intended to generate maximum revenue from families too guilty to negotiate and elderly residents too vulnerable to advocate for themselves. The care staff wasn't malicious, but they were trapped in an impossible situation. Patty, the young aide who woke me each morning, was working toward a nursing degree while supporting 2 children as a single mother. She genuinely wanted to provide good care, but with 14 residents assigned to her during each shift, she had approximately 12 minutes per person per day to address all their needs. I watched her rush from room to room, helping with basic functions like bathing, dressing, and medication management, while trying to maintain some semblance of human dignity for people who'd been reduced to entries on a task checklist. She'd arrive at work 45 minutes early and stay 30 minutes late, off the clock, because that was the only way to provide even marginally adequate care. Marcus, the evening shift supervisor, had been working in elder care for 15 years and had watched the industry transform from service-oriented to profit-driven. During quiet moments, he'd share stories about facilities where residents were treated like valued community members rather than revenue streams. Used to be, we'd have time to sit and talk with folks, he told me one evening as he helped distribute medications. Now everything's timed and tracked. If I spend more than 3 minutes with any resident, I get written up for inefficiency. The documentation requirements were particularly revealing. Staff members spent more time filling out forms about care than actually providing it. Every interaction had to be logged, timed, and justified in triplicate. The computerized system tracked productivity metrics that measured how quickly staff could complete their assigned tasks rather than how well they cared for residents. I learned that Willowbrook Manor was owned by a company called Meridian Health Services, which operated 47 similar facilities across 6 states. It was a publicly traded corporation that reported quarterly earnings to shareholders who expected consistent profit growth regardless of the human cost of achieving those margins. The facility administrator, Jennifer Walsh, no relation to the Nancy Walsh from my original nightmare, was herself a victim of corporate pressure to maximize profitability while maintaining just enough quality to avoid regulatory sanctions. She'd taken the job hoping to make a difference in elder care, but found herself implementing policies that prioritized billing efficiency over resident welfare. During my 3rd week, I witnessed Jennifer's impossible position firsthand when state inspectors arrived for their annual review. The entire facility transformed overnight into a theater production designed to demonstrate compliance with minimum care standards. Additional staff appeared from nowhere, temporary workers hired specifically for inspection week. Residents were suddenly wearing clean clothes and engaging in elaborate activities that never happened during normal operations. The kitchen prepared fresh meals that bore no resemblance to the usual reheated convenience foods. Even the building received cosmetic improvements with fresh flowers and improved lighting that disappeared the moment inspectors left. The most telling moment came when inspectors interviewed residents about their care experience. Staff members coached responses beforehand, subtly suggesting that positive feedback would be appreciated, while negative comments might result in reduced privileges or services. The elderly people, completely dependent on the facility for their basic needs, provided the expected responses like actors delivering scripted lines. Mrs. Patterson, who'd spent 3 months complaining about medication errors and inadequate meal portions, suddenly praised the facility's excellent care when inspectors interviewed her. Agnes, whose repeated requests for help with personal correspondence had been ignored for weeks, cheerfully reported that staff was always available and helpful. The regulatory system itself was part of the problem. Inspections happened on predetermined schedules, giving facilities ample time to prepare theatrical demonstrations of compliance. The standards measured easily quantifiable metrics, staffing ratios, medication protocols, safety procedures, while ignoring less measurable but equally important factors like dignity, respect, and meaningful human connection. I realized that families like mine were making decisions based on marketing materials and carefully staged tours that bore no resemblance to residents' actual daily experiences.
When my children had visited Willowbrook Manor before depositing me there, they'd seen the same performance that convinced dozens of other families to sign contracts they didn't fully understand. The financial counselor who'd explained costs to Diane, Nathan, and Camille had emphasized the base monthly fee while minimizing discussion of additional charges that could easily double the actual cost. The tour had occurred during peak activity hours when temporary staff provided enhanced attention that created an illusion of personalized care. Most families discovered the reality only after their relatives were already installed, and the guilt of moving them again became prohibitive. By then, they'd convinced themselves that any problems were temporary adjustment issues that would resolve themselves over time. The business model depended on family members' reluctance to acknowledge that they'd made a mistake. Admitting that Willowbrook Manor was inadequate would require confronting their own role in choosing convenience over quality care. It was easier to maintain the fiction that their elderly relatives were receiving excellent care in a wonderful facility.
During evening hours, when the performance ended and regular operations resumed, I observed the true character of institutional elder care. Residents sat in common areas with no supervision or engagement, staring at television programs they hadn't chosen and couldn't hear properly. Medication distribution became a factory process designed for efficiency rather than individual attention. Personal hygiene deteriorated because adequate assistance wasn't available within the time constraints staff faced. The overnight shift was particularly revealing. With minimal staffing and no administrative oversight, the facility operated in survival mode. Residents who needed bathroom assistance during night hours often had to wait 45 minutes for help, leading to accidents that created additional cleaning burdens for already overwhelmed staff. Sleep medications were distributed liberally to maintain quiet during overnight hours, regardless of residents' actual need for pharmaceutical assistance. The goal wasn't therapeutic, it was operational efficiency. Unconscious residents required less attention and created fewer interruptions for skeleton crew staff members. I began calculating the true cost of the care residents received versus the revenue the facility generated from their monthly fees. Based on actual staff time allocated per resident, food costs, facility maintenance, and administrative overhead, Willowbrook Manor was generating approximately 60% profit margins on standard care packages. The additional service fees pushed profit margins even higher, creating a system where the sickest and most vulnerable residents generated the highest revenue streams. Families who advocated for enhanced care were essentially paying premium prices for services that should have been included in basic human dignity. As I documented these observations in notebooks I kept hidden in my room, I realized that my children hadn't just abandoned me, they'd paid premium prices to ensure my systematic dehumanization. They'd researched facilities, compared options, and chosen the one that offered them the most convenient solution to the problem of my continued existence. The $4,200 monthly fee they were paying was their guilt tax, expensive enough to feel like they were providing quality care, but not so expensive that it would require them to make significant sacrifices in their own lifestyles. They could maintain their careers, their social lives, and their financial goals while purchasing the illusion that they were still loving, responsible children. But I was learning something they'd never anticipated. I was discovering exactly how this system worked, who profited from it, and where its vulnerabilities lay. I was conducting the most important business analysis of my career, and my children had provided me with unlimited time and perfect access to gather the intelligence I needed. They thought they'd solve the problem of Beatrice Calloway by warehousing me in Willowbrook Manor. Instead, they'd given me a front-row seat to study the operation I was about to acquire and transform. The descent into institutional life was nearly complete, but the education phase was just beginning. And tomorrow, I was going to start putting my newly acquired knowledge to work. The call came on Tuesday morning during what the staff euphemistically called quiet time, the period between breakfast cleanup and lunch preparation when residents were essentially parked in common areas and left to entertain themselves. I was sitting in the sunroom, ostensibly reading a romance novel from the facility's pathetic library collection, but actually observing the staff's workflow patterns when my phone buzzed.
Mrs. Calloway, this is David Richardson from First National Trust. I have some documents regarding your recent transaction that require your immediate attention. I glanced around the sunroom, confirming that the other residents were either dozing or absorbed in their own activities before taking the call. What kind of documents, Mr. Richardson? The wire transfer from TechFlow Industries has cleared, and we need to discuss investment options for the funds. Also, there are some tax implications we should address before the end of the quarter. Would you prefer to handle this over the phone, or would you like to schedule an in-person meeting? The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting in a facility where I was treated like an incompetent child who needed supervision to take my daily medications, while simultaneously managing a financial portfolio that most Fortune 500 executives would envy. The cognitive dissonance was almost amusing. "I'll need to meet in person," I said quietly. "But I'll have to come to your office. My current living situation is complicated." "Of course. Would Thursday at 2 p.m. work? I should mention, Mrs. Calloway, that we've also received inquiries from 3 additional firms interested in acquiring your consulting methodologies. The TechFlow deal seems to have generated quite a bit of attention in the industry." After ending the call, I sat back in my chair and allowed myself a moment to fully appreciate the absurd situation my children had created. They'd institutionalized a woman who was fielding acquisition offers from multiple companies while they worried about whether she could safely live alone. They'd placed someone under custodial care who was being courted by investment firms and business consultants.
But more importantly, that phone call had crystallized something that had been brewing in my mind since my first week at Willowbrook Manor. I didn't just have the financial resources to purchase this facility. I had something far more valuable. I had 30 years of expertise in identifying operational inefficiencies and implementing systematic improvements. I knew exactly what was wrong with this place and precisely how to fix it. The $12.5 million from TechFlow Industries wasn't just money, it was ammunition. But my real weapon was the knowledge I'd accumulated about how businesses operate, how systems can be optimized, and how organizations can be transformed from dysfunctional disasters into efficient, profitable, and ethical operations. That evening, instead of participating in the mandatory group television viewing in the common area, I retreated to my room and began making lists. Not shopping lists or appointment reminders like the staff assumed when they saw me writing, but strategic analyses that would have impressed the business school professors who'd never managed to attract me to their graduate programs. First, I calculated the true market value of Willowbrook Manor and its parent company, Meridian Health Services. Based on my observations of their operations, their profit margins, and their expansion trajectory, I estimated that they were significantly overextended financially. The rapid growth they'd pursued had left them leveraged beyond what their operational efficiency could support. The temporary staffing, the cosmetic improvements, and the administrative overhead required to manage regulatory compliance were eating into profit margins that looked impressive on paper, but were unsustainable in practice. More importantly, I'd identified their critical vulnerability: family satisfaction surveys. Meridian's corporate structure depended on maintaining high occupancy rates across their facilities, which required positive word-of-mouth recommendations from families who'd placed relatives in their care. But those families were making decisions based on carefully orchestrated first impressions, rather than ongoing care quality. If someone were to systematically document the gap between marketing promises and operational reality, if families began comparing notes about hidden fees and inadequate care, if regulatory attention focused on actual daily operations rather than staged compliance demonstrations, Meridian's entire business model would collapse. They needed to maintain the illusion of quality care at affordable prices. But illusions are fragile things, and I'd spent 3 weeks learning exactly where their particular illusion was most vulnerable to exposure. The second list I made was even more interesting: a comprehensive analysis of what Willowbrook Manor could become under different management. With proper staffing ratios, ethical billing practices, and genuine commitment to resident welfare, the facility could operate profitably while providing actual quality care. The current profit margins were artificially inflated by cutting corners that created false economies. Understaffing led to higher employee turnover, which increased training costs and reduced care quality.
Cheap food created nutritional deficiencies that required additional medical interventions. Minimal activities programming resulted in depression and cognitive decline that necessitated pharmaceutical management. But most significantly, the adversarial relationship between the facility and families created a defensive operational culture that prioritized covering up problems rather than solving them. Staff energy was wasted on documentation designed to protect against liability rather than documentation that improved care delivery. I calculated that with an initial investment of approximately $2 million in operational improvements, increased staffing, enhanced facilities, better food service, and expanded programming, Willowbrook Manor could become profitable at a lower per-resident cost while providing genuinely excellent care. The key was eliminating the hidden fee structure that made families feel exploited and suspicious. Instead of nickel-and-diming residents for basic human dignity, a transparent pricing model could include comprehensive services at a single monthly rate that families could budget for and trust. But the real transformation would come from changing the fundamental relationship between the facility and families. Instead of treating family involvement as an inconvenience to be managed, the operation could be restructured to encourage and facilitate ongoing family engagement. Instead of warehousing elderly people until they died, the facility could become a community hub that enhanced relationships and provided meaningful life experiences. As I worked through these calculations, I realized that purchasing Willowbrook Manor wouldn't just be an act of personal revenge. It would be a business opportunity to demonstrate that ethical elder care could be more profitable than exploitative elder care. The third list was the most satisfying to compile. A detailed analysis of how my children's own professional expertise had contributed to the problem they'd created by abandoning me. Diane's medical background had focused exclusively on clinical care metrics while ignoring the psychological and social aspects of elder wellness. She'd evaluated Willowbrook Manor like a hospital ward, checking for appropriate medical oversight without considering whether residents were actually living meaningful lives.
Nathan's legal training had led him to prioritize regulatory compliance and liability protection over resident advocacy. He'd reviewed contracts and policies to ensure the facility met minimum legal standards without questioning whether those standards were adequate for human dignity. Camille's financial planning expertise had been applied to finding the most cost-effective solution for managing my care without analyzing whether the facility's business model was sustainable or ethical. She'd calculated monthly costs without investigating the hidden fees and additional charges that would multiply those expenses. Each of them had used their professional skills to justify a decision that served their convenience while convincing themselves they were acting in my best interests. They'd applied their expertise selectively, focusing on metrics that supported their preferred outcome while ignoring data that might complicate their tidy solution. But they'd made one crucial oversight in their analysis. They'd never investigated who Beatrice Calloway actually was, or what she was capable of achieving when motivated by righteous anger and equipped with substantial resources. Thursday's meeting with David Richardson confirmed what I'd suspected about my financial position. The TechFlow acquisition had generated interest from other companies who wanted to license my operational efficiency methodologies. 2 consulting firms had made preliminary offers to acquire my client base and proprietary systems. A business school had inquired about purchasing my case study materials for their curriculum. "Mrs. Calloway," David said as we reviewed investment options in his downtown office, "you're in the unusual position of having multiple revenue streams available from your intellectual property. The consulting methodologies you've developed have significant market value beyond the immediate sale to TechFlow." I nodded, absorbing the implications. "What kind of timeline are we looking at for liquidating additional assets if I wanted to make a substantial cash purchase in the next few weeks?" David raised an eyebrow. "May I ask what kind of purchase you're considering? The tax implications could vary significantly depending on whether that's real estate, business acquisition, or investment portfolio expansion." "Business acquisition," I said. "Healthcare services, specifically. I want to purchase a company that's currently underperforming due to operational inefficiencies." "Well," David smiled, "that certainly fits your area of expertise.
With your current liquid assets plus the additional revenue streams we've identified, you could easily finance an acquisition in the $15 to $20 million range without leveraging other investments. $20 million. More than enough to purchase Meridian Health Services entirely, not just Willowbrook. More than enough to transform the entire network of facilities they operated. More than enough to demonstrate that ethical elder care could be both profitable and scalable. As I signed the paperwork authorizing David to liquidate additional assets and prepare for a major acquisition, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my children's surprise visit: complete control over my own destiny. They'd tried to manage me like an asset that had outlived its usefulness. They'd calculated the most efficient way to process the problem of my continued existence. They'd applied their professional expertise to engineer a solution that removed me from their lives while maintaining the appearance of responsible care. But they'd failed to account for one crucial variable in their analysis. Beatrice Calloway wasn't a problem to be managed. She was a force to be reckoned with, armed with 30 decades of business expertise, substantial financial resources, and a crystal-clear understanding of exactly what needed to be fixed. The descent into institutional care was about to become the foundation for the most ambitious business transformation of my career. And my children, who thought they were solving their problem by hiding me away, were about to discover that they'd actually given me the perfect laboratory to develop my most innovative solution yet. The game was about to change completely, and they had no idea that the sweet little old lady they'd abandoned was actually the new owner of their carefully constructed illusion. The next morning, I implemented what I'd privately dubbed Operation Invisible Acquisition. The beauty of being dismissed as a harmless elderly resident was that no one paid attention to my daily activities. Staff members saw me making phone calls and assumed I was chatting with old friends. They watched me taking detailed notes and figured I was working on memoirs or keeping a diary. They observed my frequent trips to the business center computer and believed I was learning to use email or playing solitaire. In reality, I was orchestrating the most complex business acquisition of my career while maintaining perfect cover as a confused old lady who needed help remembering her medication schedule. My first call was to Harrison, Blake & Associates, the most prestigious mergers and acquisitions firm in the region. I'd worked with them 5 years earlier when one of my consulting clients needed to acquire a competitor, and I knew their reputation for discretion and efficiency. "Mrs. Calloway," said Jonathan Blake when his assistant connected us. "What a pleasant surprise! I heard about the TechFlow deal. Congratulations on a very lucrative exit strategy."
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm calling because I want to acquire a healthcare services company, and I need it done quickly and quietly. How quickly can your team conduct due diligence on a target with multiple locations? Depends on the complexity, but we can usually complete preliminary analysis within 2 weeks if the target is motivated to sell. Are we talking about a distressed company? I smiled, thinking about Meridian's precarious financial position. Very distressed, though they may not realize it yet. The company is Meridian Health Services. They operate 47 elder care facilities across 6 states, including one here in the city called Willowbrook Manor. There was a pause while Jonathan processed this information. Mrs. Calloway, Meridian is a publicly traded company with approximately $180 million in annual revenue. This would be a significant acquisition. May I ask about your financing structure? Cash purchase, no financing required. I want complete ownership with no partnership arrangements or board oversight. Can you make that happen? Another pause, longer this time. Mrs. Calloway, a cash acquisition of that magnitude would require substantial resources. I have substantial resources, Jonathan. The question is whether you can execute the acquisition without revealing my identity until the deal is finalized. I want this company purchased through shell corporations and holding companies until I'm ready to announce my ownership. Certainly, we specialize in confidential acquisitions, but may I ask why the secrecy is important? I looked around the common area where I was sitting, watching staff members hurry past residents who might as well have been furniture for all the attention they received. Let's just say I want to conduct some field research before management knows they have new ownership. The due diligence process began immediately. Jonathan's team worked with military precision, analyzing Meridian's financial statements, operational reports, regulatory compliance records, and market position. What they discovered confirmed my own observations about the company's vulnerabilities. Meridian was indeed overextended, having borrowed heavily to fund their rapid expansion without adequately improving operational efficiency at existing facilities. Their debt-to-equity ratio was approaching dangerous levels, and several facilities were operating with such thin profit margins that any significant regulatory fine or family lawsuit could trigger financial crisis. More importantly, they were facing increasing pressure from state regulatory agencies who'd begun connecting patterns of complaints across their facility network. 3 facilities had received citations for inadequate staffing in the past 18 months. 2 had been fined for billing irregularities. 1 was under investigation for medication management failures. The company's stock price had declined 23% in the past year as investors grew concerned about their sustainability model. Industry analysts were beginning to question whether Meridian's profit margins were achievable without compromising care quality to unacceptable levels. While Jonathan's team conducted their financial analysis, I began the second phase of my preparation, assembling the management team that would transform Meridian's operations after I acquired the company. My first hire was Dr. Rebecca Torres, a geriatrician who'd left hospital administration because she was frustrated with healthcare systems that prioritized profit over patient care. I'd met Rebecca 3 years earlier when she'd consulted on one of my efficiency projects, and I'd been impressed by her combination of medical expertise and operational insight. "Beatrice," Rebecca said when I called her, "I thought you'd retired after the TechFlow deal. What are you working on now?" "Something different. How would you feel about becoming chief medical officer for a network of elder care facilities that's about to undergo complete operational transformation?" "That depends. Are we talking about another consulting project or something more substantial?" "I'm buying Meridian Health Services, and I want you to redesign their care delivery model from the ground up. Full autonomy, substantial budget for improvements, and complete authority to implement whatever changes you think are necessary." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Meridian has a terrible reputation in the medical community. Their facilities are known for cutting corners and prioritizing profits over patients." "Exactly, which is why they're about to get new ownership and new management. Are you interested in proving that ethical elder care can be more profitable than exploitative elder care?" "When do I start?" My second key hire was David Chen, a hospitality industry veteran who'd spent 15 years managing luxury resort operations before transitioning to healthcare administration. David understood that customer experience was the foundation of any successful service business, and he'd pioneered innovative approaches to creating environments where people actually wanted to spend time. "Mrs. Calloway, elder care facilities have traditionally operated more like warehouses than hospitality businesses. Families drop off their relatives and hope for basic competence rather than expecting excellent service. But there's no reason why assisted living can't provide the same level of experience quality that people expect from premium hotels." "What would that look like in practice?"
Personalized service plans based on individual preferences rather than standardized institutional routines. Family engagement programs that make visiting enjoyable rather than obligatory. Community activities that residents actually want to participate in, rather than time-filling busy work designed to meet regulatory requirements. I hired David as Chief Operating Officer with instructions to begin developing prototypes for family-centered care delivery that would transform the entire industry's approach to elder services. The third crucial hire was Patricia Morales, a financial systems expert who specialized in healthcare billing reform. Patricia had spent 8 years working for a company that helped medical practices transition from fee-for-service to value-based payment models, and she understood how to restructure revenue systems to align financial incentives with care quality.
The current billing model is adversarial, Patricia explained during our consultation. Families feel nickeled and dimed for basic services, which creates resentment and suspicion. But transparent pricing with comprehensive service packages can actually generate higher revenue while improving family satisfaction. How do we make that transition without losing profitability? By eliminating the administrative overhead required to track and bill for dozens of separate services. Simplified pricing reduces billing costs, while improved family relations reduce marketing expenses. Higher staff retention from better working conditions lowers training costs. It's a complete systems overhaul that improves both financial performance and care quality. While assembling my management team, I also began the delicate process of gathering intelligence about Meridian's internal operations without alerting current management to the impending acquisition. This required a level of subterfuge that reminded me of spy novels I'd enjoyed reading. I arranged for family members to tour other Meridian facilities, ostensibly researching care options for fictional elderly relatives. These reconnaissance missions, conducted by Jonathan Blake's associates, provided detailed information about operational practices, staffing patterns, and family satisfaction levels across the entire network. The reports confirmed that Willowbrook Manor wasn't an anomaly. It was representative of Meridian's standardized approach to cost-cutting and profit maximization. Every facility operated with identical understaffing ratios, similar hidden fee structures, and the same regulatory compliance theater that prioritized appearance over substance. But the reconnaissance also identified opportunities for immediate improvement that would generate both financial returns and operational efficiency gains. Better staff retention through improved compensation would reduce training costs. Enhanced family satisfaction would increase referrals and reduce marketing expenses. Improved care quality would decrease medical complications that required expensive interventions. The most valuable intelligence came from current Meridian employees who were interviewed during the family tours. Staff members at multiple facilities expressed frustration with corporate policies that prevented them from providing adequate care. Many mentioned specific operational improvements they'd suggested to management that had been rejected for financial reasons. This information was gold for planning the post-acquisition transformation. I now had a detailed roadmap of exactly which policies needed to change, which staff members were committed to care quality, and which operational improvements would have the greatest impact on both resident welfare and financial performance. By the end of my 4th week at Willowbrook Manor, the acquisition machinery was operating at full efficiency. Jonathan's team had identified the optimal approach for purchasing Meridian through a network of shell corporations that would keep my identity hidden until the deal was finalized. My management team was developing comprehensive plans for operational transformation, and I was continuing to gather real-time intelligence about facility operations from my perfect vantage point as an apparently helpless resident. The irony was exquisite. While my children continued their busy lives, confident that they'd efficiently solved the problem of my care, I was planning the most ambitious business acquisition of my career from inside the very facility where they had abandoned me. Diane called exactly once during this period, a perfunctory 3-minute conversation where she asked if I was adjusting well and mentioned that she was too busy with surgical schedules to visit, but hoped to stop by soon. Nathan sent another generic card, this one featuring a sunset and the message, "Thinking of you." Camille did nothing at all. They had no idea that while they were congratulating themselves on their efficient disposal of an inconvenient parent, that parent was quietly purchasing the entire system they'd used to warehouse her. They couldn't imagine that the woman they'd decided was too helpless to live independently was simultaneously managing complex financial transactions, hiring executive staff, and planning operational transformations that would revolutionize an entire industry. The acquisition was scheduled to close in 10 days. My new management team would assume control immediately afterward. And my children, who'd thought they'd solved their problem by hiding me away in Willowbrook Manor, were about to discover that they'd actually provided me with the perfect position to become their new landlord. The most satisfying part was that everything I was doing was completely legal, entirely ethical, and genuinely beneficial for the residents who'd been abandoned by their own families. This wasn't just revenge. It was justice with a profit margin. And tomorrow,
The final phase of my preparation would begin.
The acquisition closed on a Friday afternoon at 3:47 p.m. I was sitting in Willowbrook Manor's sunroom, ostensibly working on a crossword puzzle, when Jonathan Blake called to confirm that all documents had been signed, all funds had been transferred, and Meridian Health Services was now wholly owned by Calloway Enterprises, LLC. "Congratulations, Mrs. Calloway," Jonathan said. "You're now the sole owner of 47 elder care facilities across 6 states. When would you like to announce the change in ownership?" I watched Jennifer Walsh hurry past the sunroom window, probably dealing with another staffing crisis or family complaint. In approximately 18 hours, she would discover that the confused elderly resident in room 23B was actually her new boss. "Monday morning," I said quietly. "I want management announcements made simultaneously at all facilities. But first, I need you to implement some immediate policy changes that take effect over the weekend." What my children didn't know, what nobody at Willowbrook Manor suspected, was that I'd spent the previous week finalizing operational improvements that would begin transforming the facility before anyone realized they had new ownership. The first change was staffing. Dr. Torres had identified qualified CNAs, LPNs, and activity coordinators who were available for immediate deployment. By Saturday morning, Willowbrook Manor staff would increase by 40%, bringing the resident-to-caregiver ratio down to levels that actually allowed for dignified personal care. The existing staff would receive immediate pay raises. Patty's salary jumped from $12.50 per hour to $18.50 per hour, while Marcus got promoted to head of nursing with a 35% increase in compensation. When people provide good care under impossible conditions, you reward that dedication, not punish it with continued understaffing and poverty wages. The second transformation involved the hidden fee structure that had been generating resentment and financial stress for families. Effective immediately, all additional services were incorporated into a single monthly rate that was actually lower than what most families had been paying once all the extra charges were calculated. Personal care assistance, medication management, laundry services, family dining privileges, and enhanced activities programming were now included in everyone's basic package. The monthly rate dropped from $4,200 plus additional fees to a flat $3,800 per month with no hidden charges. But the most significant change was the new family engagement policy. Instead of treating family visits as disruptions to institutional routine, the facility would actively encourage and facilitate family involvement in residents' daily lives. The policy established minimum family interaction standards designed to maintain meaningful relationships rather than obligatory visits. Families who maintain regular engagement, defined as a minimum of 2 substantive visits per week or equivalent virtual contact, would receive priority scheduling for family events, enhanced communication from medical staff, and personalized care planning sessions. Families who rarely visited wouldn't be penalized, but they also wouldn't receive the enhanced services available to families who remained actively involved in their relatives' lives. This wasn't punishment, it was resource allocation based on family priorities. The beauty of the system was that it created incentives for behavior that benefited everyone. Residents who maintained regular family contact showed better health outcomes, reduced depression, and slower cognitive decline. Families who stayed involved felt more confident about care quality and developed better relationships with staff. The facility benefited from reduced behavioral issues, fewer medical emergencies, and increased family satisfaction. I'd learned from my weeks of observation that family engagement was the single most important factor in resident well-being. Yet the current system actively discouraged it through inconvenient visiting hours, uncomfortable environments, and adversarial relationships between families and staff. The new policy restructured everything to make family involvement natural and rewarding rather than forced and uncomfortable. The sterile visiting areas were being renovated into comfortable family lounges with kitchenettes where families could prepare meals together. The rigid visiting schedule was replaced with 24-hour access for engaged families who wanted to maintain normal relationships with their relatives. Most importantly, families would receive detailed weekly reports about their relatives' care, medical status, and participation in activities. No more guessing about whether mom was adjusting well or dad was taking his medications properly.
No more relying on brief conversations with rushed staff members for information about serious medical or behavioral changes. The communication system would include digital platforms where families could track their relatives' daily activities, communicate directly with care staff, and coordinate with other family members about visit schedules and care decisions. Technology would finally be used to enhance human connection rather than replace it. By Sunday evening, all the infrastructure changes were in place. Additional staff had been oriented and assigned to shifts. The billing system had been reprogrammed to reflect the new fee structure. Family communication platforms had been activated and tested. The physical environment had been improved with better lighting, comfortable furniture, and family-friendly spaces. But nobody at Willowbrook Manor knew why these changes were happening. Jennifer Walsh had received a memo from corporate about operational improvements and budget increases, but she assumed it was part of some new efficiency initiative from Meridian's management team. The existing staff was thrilled about the pay raises and additional colleagues, but they figured corporate had finally responded to their chronic complaints about understaffing and inadequate compensation. They had no idea that their previous corporate management had been replaced entirely.
Even more amusing was watching the staff try to figure out where these improvements were coming from. Marcus cornered Jennifer after the evening shift change, asking if she knew why corporate had suddenly become so generous with staffing budgets and salary increases. Maybe they finally realized that treating employees like garbage was costing them money in turnover and training costs, Jennifer speculated. Or maybe we're being prepped for sale to another company that wants to see improved operations. If only she knew how close to the truth that second guess actually was. The residents were equally confused, but significantly happier about the changes. Mrs. Patterson actually had enough staff attention to get help with her correspondence for the first time in months. Dorothy received assistance with her physical therapy exercises that had been ignored due to time constraints. Agnes got help organizing her personal belongings and setting up the small reading area she'd been requesting since her arrival. But the most telling reaction came from the families who visited during that transitional weekend. The Hendersons arrived Sunday afternoon expecting their usual perfunctory hour of uncomfortable conversation, only to discover that staff actually had time to discuss Mrs. Henderson's care in detail, and that the family lounge had been transformed into a comfortable space where they could spend quality time together. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Henderson's daughter asked Jennifer. "The place seems completely different than last week." "We've implemented some operational improvements," Jennifer replied diplomatically. "Corporate decided to invest in enhanced care services and family amenities." "Well, it's about time," the daughter said. "This is what we thought we were paying for in the first place." Exactly. Families hadn't been unreasonable in their expectations. They'd been disappointed by systematic corner cutting that prioritized profit over care quality. When you provided the services that families actually needed and wanted, they became allies rather than adversaries. The new policies were designed to create positive feedback loops that would improve outcomes for everyone involved. Better staffing led to better care, which led to healthier residents, which led to reduced medical costs and family satisfaction. Enhanced family engagement led to better emotional outcomes for residents, which led to improved cooperation with care plans and fewer behavioral issues. Most importantly, the changes demonstrated that ethical elder care could be more profitable than exploitative elder care when you calculated the true costs of staff turnover, regulatory violations, family dissatisfaction, and medical complications that resulted from inadequate care. As I sat in my room Sunday night, reviewing reports from the weekend's implementation, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge against my children. These changes were making genuine improvements in the lives of people who'd been forgotten and warehoused by their own families. Mrs. Patterson had received the first letter from her grandson in 6 months after staff helped her set up a video call that reminded him she was still a real person with thoughts and feelings. Harold had participated in a group activity for the first time since his arrival because there were finally enough staff members to provide individual encouragement and assistance. Tomorrow morning, Jennifer Walsh would receive a call informing her that Willowbrook Manor had new ownership and that she'd be meeting with the new owner to discuss ongoing operational improvements.
She had no idea that the new owner was currently sleeping 3 doors down from her office. But my children still had no idea that anything had changed. They would continue their busy lives, confident that they'd efficiently warehoused me in a facility that met minimum standards for care, while requiring minimum effort from them. They were about to discover that the facility where they'd abandoned me was now operating under completely different management, with completely different expectations for family engagement. The policies I'd implemented weren't designed to punish families who rarely visited, but they would definitely reveal which families prioritized their elderly relatives and which ones had simply discarded them. My children were about to find out which category they belonged in, and they weren't going to like the answer. The transformation of Willowbrook Manor was complete, but the real education was just beginning. Monday morning brought the first crack in my carefully maintained cover when Jennifer Walsh called an all-staff meeting to announce the ownership change. I was sitting in the dining room, finishing my breakfast of significantly improved scrambled eggs and fresh fruit, when she made the announcement that would begin unraveling my children's comfortable assumptions. Effective immediately, Willowbrook Manor and all Meridian Health Services facilities are under new ownership. The new company is called Calloway Enterprises, and they've made it clear that resident care and family satisfaction are their top priorities. I nearly choked on my orange juice at hearing my own name announced, but managed to maintain my expression of mild confusion that the other residents were displaying. Around me, elderly people nodded politely while having no idea that one of their fellow residents had just been revealed as their new owner.
The operational improvements you've noticed over the weekend are just the beginning, Jennifer continued. We'll be implementing comprehensive changes to enhance care quality, improve working conditions, and create better experiences for residents and their families. After the meeting, I overheard Jennifer on the phone with what I assumed was Meridian's former corporate office, trying to get more information about the acquisition. Her conversation was illuminating. No, nobody told us anything about a sale being in progress. Yes, the improvements started over the weekend, but we thought they were corporate initiatives. Calloway Enterprises? I've never heard of them. What do you mean you can't provide more information? The confusion was spreading exactly as I'd planned. Former Meridian management was scrambling to understand what had happened to their company, while current facility staff was trying to figure out who their new owners were and what other changes might be coming. But the most interesting development came Tuesday afternoon, when Camille made her first visit to Willowbrook Manor since depositing me there 5 weeks earlier. She arrived unannounced, clearly expecting to find the same depressing institutional environment she'd left me in, and was visibly startled by the transformation she encountered. The first sign that something was different was the parking lot, which was busier than she'd ever seen it. Families were coming and going at all hours now, taking advantage of the new flexible visiting policies. The lobby, which had been empty except for a few residents staring at muted television during her previous visits, was bustling with activity. "Mom," she called as she entered my room, looking around with obvious confusion. "This place seems different." I looked up from the book I was reading, a business strategy text I'd ordered online, though I told staff it was a romance novel. "Different? How, dear? It's lovely to see you. What brings you by?" "Well, I was in the area for a client meeting and thought I'd stop in, but the parking lot was full and there are people everywhere. Has something changed?" Perfect. Camille's financial planning instincts were immediately picking up on the operational changes, even though she couldn't yet identify what was causing them. "Oh, I think they've hired more staff, and they've been doing some renovations. Everyone seems much happier lately." Camille walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where families were loading elderly relatives into cars for outings, something that had been virtually impossible under the previous management due to staffing constraints and bureaucratic obstacles. "This is expensive," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "All these improvements, additional staff, enhanced services? Someone's making major investments here." I watched my youngest daughter's analytical mind begin working through the implications. As a financial planner, she understood that operational improvements of this magnitude required substantial capital investment and suggested either new ownership or major refinancing. "Have you met any of the new staff?" she asked, turning back to me. "Has anyone mentioned why they're making all these changes?" "I think the facility was sold to a new company. Something about better care standards and family satisfaction, though I don't really understand business things like that." Camille's expression sharpened. "Sold? When? Do you know who bought it?" "Oh, I wouldn't know about such things, dear. But the staff seems much more relaxed, and the food has improved considerably." After Camille left, I knew the investigation phase was beginning. Financial planners don't like unexplained changes in their carefully calculated arrangements, and she'd just discovered that the facility where she'd warehoused her mother was operating under completely different management with completely different cost structures. Wednesday brought the next development when Nathan called Jennifer Walsh directly, demanding information about the ownership change and its implications for existing resident contracts. I was in the common area when Jennifer took the call, and I could hear her side of the conversation from my seat near the nursing station. "Mr. Calloway, I understand your concerns about the changes, but I can assure you that all existing contracts remain valid. Yes, the new ownership has enhanced services, but there's no increase in costs for current residents. Actually, the new fee structure is more comprehensive and typically results in lower overall costs for families." Nathan was clearly probing for information about financial implications and legal obligations under the new ownership. As an attorney, he understood that ownership changes could affect contract terms, service levels, and billing practices. The new owners have implemented what they call family engagement incentives. Families who maintain regular contact with residents receive enhanced communication and priority scheduling for family events. No, it's not required, but families who visit regularly do receive additional services. I could practically hear Nathan's legal mind spinning through this information. He was recognizing that the comfortable arrangement he'd negotiated, minimal family involvement with maximum institutional responsibility, was being restructured to encourage active family participation. Thursday's investigation escalated when Deanne arrived unannounced during her lunch break, ostensibly to check on me, but actually to conduct her own assessment of the facility's changes.
"Mom, Camille mentioned that there have been some significant improvements here," she said, looking around my room with the clinical eye she'd developed during medical training. "The nursing staff seems more attentive, and she said something about new ownership." "Yes, everyone's been much more helpful lately," I agreed. "They actually have time to answer questions and help with personal care. It's quite nice." Diane spent the next 20 minutes conducting what was essentially a covert inspection of the facility, checking staffing levels, observing resident care, and evaluating the general environment. Her medical background enabled her to recognize that the improvements went far beyond cosmetic changes. "This represents a major investment in operational infrastructure," she told me as she prepared to leave. "New ownership, enhanced staffing, improved protocols. Someone's spending serious money to transform this place." "Is that good or bad?" I asked with the innocent confusion of someone who didn't understand business operations. It's unexpected," Diane said carefully. "Major healthcare acquisitions usually involve cost-cutting to improve profit margins, but this looks like the opposite. Significant investment in quality improvements that would typically reduce profitability." That evening, I received a call that confirmed my children were actively investigating the changes at Willowbrook Manor. "Mrs. Calloway," said a voice I didn't recognize. "This is Michael Sterling from Sterling Investigations. I've been asked to research the recent ownership change at Willowbrook Manor and its implications for current residents and their families." I kept my voice carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number. I'm a resident here, not someone who would know about ownership changes." "Actually, ma'am, I'm calling because your children hired me to investigate the new owners and understand how the changes might affect your care and their financial obligations."
Perfect. My children had hired a private investigator to research the acquisition they couldn't understand. They were so suspicious of improvements that benefited their mother that they'd paid professionals to investigate who was responsible. I see, I said wealthily. Well, I'm afraid I don't know anything about business matters. You'd need to speak with the administration about ownership questions. Friday brought the most telling development when all three of my children arrived together for an emergency family meeting, ostensibly to discuss the concerning changes at Willowbrook Manor. Mom, Sarah began, settling into the chair beside my bed with the serious expression she used for difficult legal negotiations, we need to talk about what's happening at this facility. Happening? I asked innocently. The ownership change, the operational improvements, the new policies. We're concerned about how these changes might affect your care and our financial obligations. Camille added, from a financial perspective, these improvements suggest either major debt financing or significant cash investment by new owners. Either scenario could impact the facility's long-term stability. I looked at my three successful children who'd spent more time and energy investigating improvements to my care than they'd invested in visiting me, and felt a mixture of amusement and disgust. Are you upset that the facility is providing better care? I asked mildly. We're not upset, Diane clarified quickly. We're concerned about sustainability. When healthcare facilities make dramatic operational changes, it often indicates financial instability or upcoming cost increases. The private investigator we hired hasn't been able to identify the new owners. The acquisition was structured through multiple shell corporations that make it impossible to determine who's actually behind the purchase. Why would anyone want to hide their identity when buying healthcare facilities? Camille wondered aloud. I almost laughed at the irony. They were suspicious of anonymous ownership of the facility where they'd hidden me away, never imagining that the anonymous owner was the mother they'd abandoned. Maybe they want to observe operations without management knowing they're being watched. Some business owners prefer to see how things really work before revealing their identity. My children exchanged meaningful looks, clearly considering this possibility. That would make sense, Sarah admitted. Anonymous ownership would allow new owners to assess operations, staffing performance, and family satisfaction without the artificial improvements that typically occur when management knows they're being evaluated. Exactly, Nathan agreed. It's actually a sophisticated acquisition strategy. Purchase the company quietly, observe real operations, then implement changes based on authentic rather than staged performance data. They were so close to understanding my strategy that it was almost painful not to reveal everything immediately. But patience had served me well so far, and the investigation phase was providing valuable intelligence about their priorities and concerns. As they prepared to leave after their 45-minute emergency consultation about my improved care, I realized that their investigation was revealing more about them than about Willowbrook Manor's new ownership. They'd hired private investigators to research who was spending money to improve their mother's quality of life. They'd conducted covert facility inspections to evaluate whether enhanced care services were financially sustainable. They'd held family meetings to discuss whether better treatment for their elderly mother represented a threat to their comfortable arrangements.
Not once had any of them expressed gratitude for the improvements or relief that I was receiving better care. Their entire focus was on understanding and potentially controlling factors that might disrupt their carefully constructed system for managing my existence while minimizing their involvement. The investigation phase was revealing exactly what I'd suspected. My children viewed any change in my situation as a potential problem for them to solve rather than a benefit for me to enjoy. Tomorrow would bring the next stage of their education, as the anonymous new owner prepared to make her first official appearance. The moment of revelation arrived on Monday morning at 10 a.m. sharp. I had arranged for Jennifer Walsh to schedule a mandatory family meeting with what she described as urgent communication from the new ownership regarding family engagement policies. My children, already suspicious and concerned about the mysterious changes at Willowbrook Manor, agreed to attend immediately. What they didn't know was that the mysterious new owner they'd been investigating would be sitting at the head of the conference table when they arrived. I spent extra time that morning selecting my outfit, the same navy blue suit I'd worn to close the TechFlow deal, paired with the pearls Catherine had given me for my 60th birthday. If my children were going to meet their new landlord, Beatrice Calloway was going to look every inch the successful businesswoman she'd always been. The conference room had been transformed over the weekend. Gone was the sterile institutional furniture, replaced with a polished mahogany table surrounded by comfortable leather chairs. The walls now displayed framed certificates of my business achievements, awards from consulting clients, and a large photograph of the ribbon-cutting ceremony when I'd opened my first office 30 years ago. At exactly 9:45, I positioned myself at the head of the table with a stack of documents, including the acquisition papers, operational improvement reports, and detailed analyses of family engagement patterns since the ownership change. Jennifer Walsh sat to my right, her expression a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She'd learned my identity only that morning and was still processing the revelation that the quiet resident in room 23B was actually her new boss. "Mrs. Calloway," Jennifer whispered as we waited, "are you certain you want to handle this confrontation personally? I could present the new policies and family expectations without revealing your identity." I smiled, feeling a calm confidence I hadn't experienced since my children's original betrayal. "Jennifer, I've been planning this meeting for 6 weeks. They're going to learn exactly who they've been dealing with." At 10 o'clock precisely, Diane arrived first, her surgical precision evident in her punctual arrival and professional appearance. She nodded politely to Jennifer and took a seat halfway down the table, clearly expecting to be briefed by administrative staff about policy changes. Nathan followed 2 minutes later, carrying his legal portfolio and wearing the focused expression he used for important client meetings. He sat across from Diane, pulling out his yellow legal pad to take notes about whatever administrative announcements were forthcoming. Camille rushed in at 10:05, apologizing for traffic while checking her phone for missed calls from clients. She chose a seat near the door, positioning herself for a quick exit once the meeting concluded and she could return to her busy schedule. None of them looked directly at me. To them, I was just another elderly resident who happened to be in the conference room, probably confused about why I was there. They'd become so accustomed to dismissing my presence that they didn't even register that I was sitting in the position of authority at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice carrying the professional authority I'd used in boardrooms for 30 decades. All 3 of my children looked up in shock, suddenly realizing that the meeting wasn't being conducted by Jennifer Walsh, but by their supposedly helpless mother. "Mom?" Diane said, confusion evident in her voice. "Shouldn't the administrator be running this meeting?" "I am running this meeting," I replied calmly, sliding copies of the acquisition documents across the table to each of them, "because I am the new owner of Willowbrook Manor and 46 other elder care facilities across 6 states. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling vents. 3 successful professionals, accustomed to processing complex information quickly, sat frozen as they tried to comprehend what they'd just heard. Nathan was the first to recover, reaching for the documents with the automatic reflex of a lawyer confronted with legal papers.
His eyes scanned the acquisition agreement, the ownership transfer documents, and the corporate registration papers for Calloway Enterprises, LLC. This says you purchased Meridian Health Services for $184 million, he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Where did you get $184 million? From selling my consulting business to TechFlow Industries for $12.5 million, plus liquidating additional intellectual property assets and securing acquisition financing based on my business track record. The same business you never bothered to ask about. The same financial resources you never bothered to investigate before deciding I was too helpless to manage my own affairs.
Camille was staring at the financial statements Jennifer had prepared, her face growing pale as she processed the numbers. Mom, these documents show liquid assets of over $8 million remaining after the acquisition. You have more money than all of us combined. Significantly more, I confirmed. And unlike your money, mine was earned by solving problems rather than creating them. Diane found her voice, though it sounded strained. But why? Why would you buy this place? Why didn't you tell us you had these resources? I leaned back in my chair, studying the faces of my 3 children as they grappled with the complete reversal of everything they thought they knew about their mother and their family dynamics. Tell you? I repeated. When exactly should I have mentioned it? During the intervention where you informed me that my living situation needed to change? During the 2 weeks when you systematically dismantled my life and packed my belongings like I was already dead? Or perhaps during the 5 weeks since you abandoned me here, when you visited a combined total of 3 times? The accusations hung in the air like accusations of war crimes. My children, who'd built their identities around their professional competence and family responsibility, were being forced to confront evidence of their spectacular failure in both areas. You let us think you were financially vulnerable, Nathan said, his lawyer's mind trying to find some legal or ethical framework for what he was experiencing. You allowed us to make decisions based on incomplete information. I allowed you to reveal your true priorities, I corrected. You never asked about my financial situation, my business success, or my capability to make my own decisions. You simply assumed that age equals incompetence and proceeded accordingly. Jennifer Walsh, who'd been silent during this family confrontation, cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps I should explain the operational changes that have been implemented since the acquisition. Please do, I said, grateful for the transition from personal recriminations to business matters. Jennifer consulted her notes, her professional demeanor helping to stabilize the chaotic emotional atmosphere in the room. Under the new ownership, Willowbrook Manor has increased staffing by 40%, eliminated hidden fees, implemented comprehensive family engagement policies, and enhanced care protocols based on industry best practices. Family engagement policies? Diane asked warily. Families who maintain regular contact with residents, defined as a minimum of 2 meaningful visits per week, receive priority access to family events, enhanced communication with medical staff, and personalized care planning sessions. The policy is designed to encourage ongoing family involvement rather than the previous model where families could essentially abandon residents and expect institutional care to replace family relationships. Camille was frantically calculating numbers on her phone. You're saying that families who visit regularly get better services than families who don't? I'm saying that families who prioritize their elderly relatives receive services that support that prioritization. Resources are allocated based on family engagement levels. If you want premium family services, you provide premium family involvement. Nathan's legal instincts kicked in. That sounds like discrimination based on family circumstances. Some families have legitimate reasons for limited visitation, work obligations, geographic distance, personal health issues, and those families receive standard care services without penalty.
but they don't receive the enhanced services available to families who make their elderly relatives a priority. It's resource allocation, not discrimination. Diane was processing the medical implications. You're essentially creating a two-tier system where resident care quality depends on family involvement. I'm creating a system where family involvement is recognized and rewarded rather than discouraged and penalized. Residents with engaged families have better health outcomes, reduced depression, and slower cognitive decline. The enhanced services support those positive outcomes. The revelation was sinking in now. My children were beginning to understand that their comfortable arrangement, where they could maintain minimal involvement while expecting maximum institutional responsibility, had been completely restructured by the very mother they'd tried to warehouse. "So where does this leave us?" Camille asked, her financial planning instincts focusing on practical implications. "What are your expectations for our family?" I smiled, feeling the satisfaction of a chess player who just revealed checkmate. "That depends on entirely what kind of children you want to be. You can continue your current pattern of minimal involvement and receive standard care services, or you can become actively engaged in your mother's life and receive the enhanced services available to families who actually prioritize their elderly relatives." "This is manipulation," Nathan said, his lawyer's training making him resistant to any situation where he wasn't in control of the terms. "This is consequences," I replied. "For the first time in your adult lives, you're experiencing consequences for treating your mother like an inconvenience. You can adapt to the new reality, or you can continue your current behavior and accept the limitations that come with it." The meeting had lasted 45 minutes, but I could see that my children needed time to process what they had learned. Their entire understanding of family dynamics, financial resources, and decision-making authority had been turned upside down.
"I think," I said, standing to signal the end of the meeting, "you need some time to discuss among yourselves what kind of relationship you want to have with your mother going forward. Jennifer will be happy to explain the family engagement policies in detail and help you understand what options are available." As they gathered their documents and prepared to leave, still looking shell-shocked by the revelations, I added one final thought. "Oh, and children? The next time you decide someone is too helpless to manage their own affairs, you might want to investigate what they're actually capable of before making that assumption." The door closed behind them, leaving Jennifer and me alone in the conference room that had just witnessed the most satisfying business meeting of my career. "How do you think that went?" Jennifer asked with a slight smile. "Exactly as planned. Now we'll see what they do with the information." The first response came exactly 4 hours after the meeting ended. Nathan called Jennifer Walsh's office, demanding to speak with legal counsel representing the new ownership about potential conflicts of interest and improper use of healthcare facilities for personal vendettas. I was in the renovated family lounge, ostensibly participating in the afternoon book club, but actually listening to Jennifer's side of the conversation through the open door of her office. "Mr. Calloway, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you that all facility operations comply with state regulations and corporate governance standards," Jennifer said diplomatically. "Your mother's ownership of the facility doesn't create any legal conflicts regarding her residence here." "What about the family engagement policies? Are they being applied uniformly, or are they designed to target specific families?" "The policies apply equally to all residents and their families. No family receives different treatment based on their relationship to ownership. The enhanced services are available to any family that meets the engagement criteria." Nathan wasn't satisfied. He had a flexible understanding of any expectation of the family being cohesive. "I want copies of all policy documents, family engagement metrics for the past 6 weeks, and documentation showing that these policies existed before my mother's acquisition of the facility." Jennifer glanced toward the lounge where I was sitting. "I'll need to consult with ownership about releasing internal policy documents to family members." After she hung up, Jennifer appeared in the doorway of the family lounge.
Mrs. Calloway, your son is requesting documentation about policy implementation timelines. How would you like me to respond? I smiled, closing my book. Send him everything he's requested. Complete transparency. I want Nathan to see exactly when these policies were developed, how they've been implemented, and what the results have been. The documentation would show that the family engagement policies had been drafted before the acquisition was finalized, implemented immediately upon ownership transfer, and applied uniformly across all residents regardless of their family relationships. Nathan's legal review would confirm that everything was proper, ethical, and designed to benefit residents rather than target specific families. But it would also reveal the uncomfortable truth that his own family's visiting patterns ranked them in the bottom 15% of all families for engagement levels. The data would show that they'd averaged 1.2 visits per week across 3 children, with an average visit duration of 23 minutes. Compared to families who maintained regular involvement, their pattern looked exactly like what it was: systematic abandonment. Tuesday brought Camille's response, which arrived in the form of a detailed financial analysis she'd prepared overnight. She'd somehow obtained public records about the Meridian acquisition, researched Calloway Enterprises' corporate structure, and calculated projected return on investment for the operational improvements. "Mom," she said when she arrived for what she called a financial consultation meeting, "I've run the numbers on your acquisition, and I'm concerned about the sustainability of your investment strategy." I was in my room reviewing staff reports about resident satisfaction improvements since the policy changes. Concerned about what specifically? Camille spread her documents across my small table, transforming my living space into a makeshift financial planning office. "You've invested $184 million in acquisition costs, plus approximately $12 million in operational improvements across all facilities. But the enhanced services you're providing will reduce profit margins by an estimated 35 to 40%. And?" I prompted, curious to see where her analysis was leading. "And the return on investment timeline extends beyond typical healthcare industry expectations. You're essentially running a charity operation disguised as a business acquisition." I studied my youngest daughter, who'd spent her career helping people make smart financial decisions, but couldn't understand why someone would choose to prioritize care quality over maximum profitability. "Camille, what's the most important metric in healthcare investment?" She consulted her notes. "Typically, investors focus on profit margin sustainability, regulatory compliance costs, and market expansion potential. What about patient outcomes?" Camille paused, clearly not having considered health and wellness improvements as financial metrics. "Well, better patient outcomes can reduce liability costs and improve regulatory ratings." "What about family satisfaction?" "Family satisfaction affects occupancy rates and referral patterns," she admitted reluctantly. "What about staff retention?" "Lower turnover reduces training costs and improves care consistency."
I smiled, watching her analytical mind begin to process the connections between ethical care practices and long-term financial sustainability. So, better care leads to better health outcomes, which leads to lower medical costs and higher family satisfaction, which leads to better occupancy rates and increased referrals, which leads to higher revenue and reduced marketing expenses. Camille stared at her spreadsheets, recalculating projections based on variables she hadn't originally considered. "You're running a long-term value creation strategy instead of a short-term profit maximization model." "Exactly. And what does that tell you about the sustainability of my investment?" "That you're probably going to be more profitable than traditional healthcare operations, just on a different timeline." Wednesday brought the most interesting response when Diane arrived with Dr. Rebecca Torres, whom she'd somehow identified as the new chief medical officer for Calloway Enterprises. "Mom, I've asked Dr. Torres to meet with us because I have concerns about the medical implications of your family engagement policies," Diane announced, clearly having prepared for this conversation like a medical conference presentation.
Dr. Torres and I exchanged subtle smiles as we took seats in the family lounge. She'd been thoroughly briefed on my children's behavior patterns and was prepared for whatever medical arguments Diane might present. Dr. Calloway, Rebecca began diplomatically, I understand you have questions about how family engagement affects resident care quality. Yes, Diane replied, pulling out medical journals and research papers. I've reviewed literature on family involvement in elder care, and while emotional support is beneficial, creating service tiers based on family visit frequency could potentially compromise medical care for residents whose families have legitimate constraints on visitation. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid concern. Could you walk me through your specific worries about medical care disparities? For the next 20 minutes, Diane presented a carefully researched argument about the medical ethics of linking care quality to family involvement. Her presentation was thorough, professional, and completely missed the point of what the policies actually accomplished. Dr. Calloway, Rebecca said when Diane finished, your research is excellent, but I think you may have misunderstood how our family engagement policies work in practice. Would you like to see the actual health outcome data since implementation? Rebecca produced charts showing medication compliance rates, incident reports, depression screening scores, and cognitive assessment results for residents with high family engagement versus those with minimal family involvement. As you can see, Rebecca explained, residents with engaged families show significant improvements across all health metrics. The enhanced services we provide to those families, regular communication, care plan collaboration, family education, support these positive outcomes. Diane studied the data with growing recognition. You're not creating different levels of medical care. You're providing different levels of family services that improve medical outcomes. Exactly. Families who invest time in their relatives' care receive services that enhance their ability to participate effectively. Families who don't invest that time receive standard medical care without the enhanced support services. So residents aren't receiving different medical treatment based on family involvement? All residents receive identical medical care based on their individual needs, but families receive different levels of communication and collaboration services based on their engagement levels. Diane was quiet for several minutes, processing the distinction between medical care equality and family service differentiation. Finally, she looked at me with something approaching respect. This is actually brilliant, she admitted. You're using family service incentives to improve resident health outcomes without compromising medical care standards. Thursday brought the coordinated response I'd been expecting. All 3 children arrived together, clearly having spent significant time developing a unified strategy for dealing with their transformed family dynamics. Mom, we've discussed the situation, and we want to propose a new arrangement that addresses everyone's needs. I settled back in my chair, curious to see what kind of negotiation strategy they'd developed. We recognize that we haven't been as attentive as we should have been, Diane continued, and we appreciate the improvements you've made to the facility, but we're concerned about the sustainability of policies that essentially require families to meet specific visitation quotas. Camille pulled out a document they'd obviously prepared together. We'd like to propose a structured family engagement plan that provides regular contact while accommodating our professional obligations. The document outlined a rotating schedule where each child would take responsibility for weekly visits, family event coordination, and communication with medical staff. It was comprehensive, efficient, and completely missed the emotional point of family relationships. This is very thorough, I said, reviewing their proposal, but it treats family engagement like a business obligation to be managed rather than a relationship to be enjoyed. We want to be realistic about what we can commit to, Nathan explained. Professional obligations, geographic constraints, and family responsibilities create scheduling challenges that need to be acknowledged. I looked at my 3 children, who'd approached reconciliation with their mother like a corporate merger requiring careful negotiation and risk management. I have a counterproposal, I said, standing and walking to the window that overlooked the bustling parking lot where families were coming and going throughout the day. What if, instead of treating visits to your mother like professional obligations to be scheduled and managed, you simply came to see me because you wanted to spend time with me? The suggestion seemed to confuse them.
What if you called me because you were curious about my day, my thoughts, my experiences, rather than because you felt guilty about not calling? They exchanged uncertain glances. What if you treated me like a person you enjoyed being around rather than a responsibility you needed to manage efficiently? The silence that followed was profound. My children, who'd become experts at managing obligations and optimizing schedules, had never considered that their mother might be someone they could simply enjoy spending time with. "Mom," Camille said softly, "we don't know how to do that anymore." The admission was heartbreaking in its honesty. My successful, accomplished children had become so focused on efficiency and obligation that they'd forgotten how to have spontaneous, genuine relationships with the people they claimed to love. "Then," I said, turning back to face them, "maybe it's time you learned." Friday would bring the beginning of that education. The first response came exactly 4 hours after the meeting ended. Nathan called Jennifer Walsh's office, demanding to speak with legal counsel representing the new ownership about potential conflicts of interest and improper use of healthcare facilities for personal vendettas. I was in the renovated family lounge, ostensibly participating in the afternoon book club, but actually listening to Jennifer's side of the conversation through the open door of her office. "Mr. Calloway, I understand your concerns, but I can assure you that all facility operations comply with state regulations and corporate governance standards," Jennifer said diplomatically. "Your mother's ownership of the facility doesn't create any legal conflicts regarding her residence here." "What about the family engagement policies?" Nathan pressed. "Are they being applied uniformly, or are they designed to target specific families?" "The policies apply equally to all residents and their families. No family receives different treatment based on their relationship to ownership. The enhanced services are available to any family that meets the engagement criteria." Nathan wasn't satisfied. "I want copies of all policy documents, family engagement metrics for the past 6 weeks, and documentation showing that these policies existed before my mother's acquisition of the facility." Jennifer glanced toward the lounge where I was sitting. "I'll need to consult with ownership about releasing internal policy documents to family members." After she hung up, Jennifer appeared in the doorway of the family lounge. "Mrs. Calloway, your son is requesting documentation about policy implementation timelines. How would you like me to respond?" I smiled, closing my book. "Send him everything he's requested. Complete transparency. I want Nathan to see exactly when these policies were developed, how they've been implemented, and what the results have been." The documentation would show that the family engagement policies had been drafted before the acquisition was finalized, implemented immediately upon ownership transfer, and applied uniformly across all residents regardless of their family relationships. Nathan's legal review would confirm that everything was proper, ethical, and designed to benefit residents rather than target specific families. But it would also reveal the uncomfortable truth that his own family's visiting patterns ranked them in the bottom 15% of all families for engagement levels. The data would show that they'd averaged 1.2 visits per week across 3 children, with an average visit duration of 23 minutes. Compared to families who maintained regular involvement, their pattern looked exactly like what it was: systematic abandonment. Tuesday brought Camille's response, which arrived in the form of a detailed financial analysis she'd prepared overnight. She'd somehow obtained public records about the Meridian acquisition, researched Calloway Enterprises' corporate structure, and calculated projected return on investment for the operational improvements. "Mom," she said, when she arrived for what she called a financial consultation meeting, "I've run the numbers on your acquisition, and I'm concerned about the sustainability of your investment strategy." I was in my room, reviewing staff reports about resident satisfaction improvements since the policy changes. "Concerned about what specifically?" Camille spread her documents across my small table, transforming my living space into a makeshift financial planning office.
You've invested $184 million in acquisition costs, plus approximately $12 million in operational improvements across all facilities. But the enhanced services you're providing will reduce profit margins by an estimated 35 to 40%. And, I prompted, curious to see where her analysis was leading. And the return on investment timeline extends beyond typical healthcare industry expectations. You're essentially running a charity operation disguised as a business acquisition. I studied my youngest daughter, who'd spent her career helping people make smart financial decisions, but couldn't understand why someone would choose to prioritize care quality over maximum profitability. Camille, what's the most important metric in healthcare?
She consulted her notes. Typically, investors focus on profit margin sustainability, regulatory compliance costs, and market expansion potential. What about patient outcomes? Camille paused, clearly not having considered health and wellness improvements as financial metrics. Well, better patient outcomes can reduce liability costs and improve regulatory ratings. What about family satisfaction? Family satisfaction affects occupancy rates and referral patterns, she admitted reluctantly. What about staff retention? Lower turnover reduces training costs and improves care consistency. I smiled, watching her analytical mind begin to process the connections between ethical care practices and long-term financial sustainability. So, better care leads to better health outcomes, which leads to lower medical costs and higher family satisfaction, which leads to higher occupancy rates and increased referrals, which leads to higher revenue and reduced marketing expenses. Camille stared at her spreadsheets, recalculating projections based on variables she hadn't originally considered. You're running a long-term value creation strategy instead of a short-term profit maximization model. Exactly. And what does that tell you about the sustainability of my investment? That you're probably going to be more profitable than traditional healthcare operations, just on a different timeline. Wednesday brought the most interesting response when Diane arrived with Dr. Rebecca Torres, whom she'd somehow identified as the new chief medical officer for Calloway Enterprises. Mom, I've asked Dr. Torres to meet with us because I have concerns about the medical implications of your family engagement policies, Diane announced, clearly having prepared for this conversation like a medical conference presentation. Dr. Torres and I exchanged subtle smiles as we took seats in the family lounge. She'd been thoroughly briefed on my children's behavior patterns and was prepared for whatever medical arguments Diane might present. Dr. Calloway, Rebecca began diplomatically, I understand you have questions about how family engagement affects resident care quality. Yes, Diane replied, pulling out medical journals and research papers. I've reviewed literature on family involvement in elder care, and while emotional support is beneficial, creating service tiers based on family visit frequency could potentially compromise medical care for residents whose families have legitimate constraints on visitation. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. That's a valid concern. Could you walk me through your specific worries about medical care disparities? For the next 20 minutes, Diane presented a carefully researched argument about the medical ethics of linking care quality to family involvement. Her presentation was thorough, professional, and completely missed the point of what the policies actually accomplished. Dr. Calloway, Rebecca said when Diane finished, your research is excellent, but I think you may have misunderstood how our family engagement policies work in practice. Would you like to see the actual health outcome data since implementation? Rebecca produced charts showing medication compliance rates, incident reports, depression screening scores, and cognitive assessment results for residents with high family engagement versus those with minimal family involvement. As you can see, Rebecca explained, residents with engaged families show significant improvements across all health metrics. The enhanced services we provide to those families, regular communication, care plan collaboration, family education, support these positive outcomes. Diane studied the data with growing recognition. You're not creating different levels of medical care.
You're providing different levels of family service support services that improve medical outcomes. Exactly. Families who invest time in their relatives' care receive services that enhance their ability to participate effectively. Families who don't invest that time receive standard medical care without the enhanced support services. So, residents aren't receiving different medical treatment based on family involvement? All residents receive identical medical care based on their individual needs, but families receive different levels of communication and collaboration services based on their engagement levels. Diane was quiet for several minutes, processing the distinction between medical care equality and family service differentiation. Finally, she looked at me with something approaching respect. "This is actually brilliant," she admitted. "You're using family service incentives to improve resident health outcomes without compromising medical care standards." Thursday brought the coordinated response I'd been expecting. All 3 children arrived together, clearly having spent significant time developing a unified strategy for dealing with their transformed family dynamics. "Mom, we've discussed the situation and we want to propose a new arrangement that addresses everyone's needs." I settled back in my chair, curious to see what kind of negotiation strategy they'd developed. "We recognize that we haven't been as attentive as we should have been, and we appreciate the improvements you've made to the facility, but we're concerned about the sustainability of policies that essentially require families to meet specific visitation quotas." Camille pulled out a document they'd obviously prepared together. "We'd like to propose a structured family engagement plan that provides regular contact while accommodating our professional obligations." The document outlined a rotating schedule where each child would take responsibility for weekly visits, family event coordination, and communication with medical staff. It was comprehensive, efficient, and completely missed the emotional point of family relationships. "This is very thorough," I said, reviewing their proposal. "But it treats family engagement like a business obligation to be managed rather than a relationship to be enjoyed. We want to be realistic about what we can commit to," Nathan explained. "Professional obligations, geographic constraints, and family responsibilities create scheduling challenges that need to be acknowledged."
I looked at my 3 children, who'd approached reconciliation with their mother like a corporate merger requiring careful negotiation and risk management. "I have a counter-proposal," I said, standing and walking to the window that overlooked the bustling parking lot where families were coming and going throughout the day. "What if, instead of treating visits to your mother like professional obligations to be scheduled and managed, you simply came to see me because you wanted to spend time with me?" The suggestion seemed to confuse them. "What if you called me because you were curious about my day, my thoughts, my experiences, rather than because you felt guilty about not calling?" They exchanged uncertain glances. "What if you treated me like a person you enjoyed being around rather than a responsibility you needed to manage efficiently?" The silence that followed was profound. My children, who'd become experts at managing obligations and optimizing schedules, had never considered that their mother might be someone they could simply enjoy spending time with. "Mom," Camille said softly, "we don't know how to do that anymore." The admission was heartbreaking in its honesty. My successful, accomplished children had become so focused on efficiency and obligation that they'd forgotten how to have spontaneous, genuine relationships with the people they claimed to love. "Then," I said, turning back to face them, "maybe it's time you learned." Today marks exactly 6 months since I purchased Willowbrook Manor and 47 other facilities. As I write this from my new office, yes, I moved out of room 23B and into the executive suite, I can see families throughout the parking lot and gardens not just visiting their elderly relatives, but genuinely enjoying time together. The transformation has exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Resident satisfaction scores have increased by 78%.
Family engagement levels across all facilities have more than doubled. Staff retention has improved so dramatically that we now have waiting lists of qualified professionals wanting to work for Calloway Enterprises. Most importantly, we've proven that ethical elder care is more profitable than exploitative elder care. Our facilities now operate with 15% higher profit margins than industry averages, while providing significantly better care and family services. The model has attracted attention from healthcare investors worldwide who want to license our operational frameworks. But the real success story is much more personal. Diane now visits twice a week, not because of policy requirements, but because she's discovered that her mother is actually interesting to talk to. We discuss medical advances, debate healthcare policy, and share stories about our respective careers. She's learned that the woman who raised her is someone worth knowing as an adult. Nathan has become our unofficial legal counsel, helping navigate regulatory frameworks for expanding our operational improvements to other healthcare systems. His initial outrage about family engagement policies has transformed into advocacy for legislation that would make such policies standard across the industry. Camille has taken over financial planning for Calloway Enterprises and is developing investment strategies that prioritize both profitability and social impact. She's discovered that some of the most satisfying financial returns come from investments that improve people's lives. They still struggle sometimes with spontaneous relationship building rather than scheduled obligation management, but they're learning that their mother is someone they genuinely enjoy spending time with, not just someone they're responsible for caring about. The other residents have benefited as much as my family. Mrs. Patterson now receives regular visits from grandchildren who've discovered that their grandmother has fascinating stories to tell. Harold's daughters have realized that their father's wisdom and humor didn't disappear just because he needed assistance with daily activities. We've created something revolutionary in elder care. Facilities where elderly people live with dignity, where families maintain meaningful relationships, and where staff members feel valued for providing excellent care rather than rush through minimal obligations. The model is expanding. 3 other healthcare companies have contracted with us to implement our family engagement systems. 2 universities are developing curriculum based on our operational frameworks. State regulatory agencies are considering legislation that would make transparent pricing and family engagement standards mandatory across the industry. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome is that my children have learned the lesson I most wanted to teach them: that people don't become less valuable as they age, less interesting as they need assistance, or less worthy of respect as they require care. They've discovered that abandoning elderly relatives isn't just cruel to the people being abandoned, it's a devastating loss for the families who choose convenience over connection. My story began with 3 successful children who made the worst decision of their lives by underestimating their mother and discarding her when she became inconvenient. It ends with those same children learning that their mother was the most interesting, accomplished, and formidable person they had ever known, and that they'd almost lost the opportunity to discover that because they'd confused age with incompetence. Sometimes the people you think you're taking care of are actually the ones taking care of you. Sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who will teach you the most important lesson of your life. And sometimes buying a nursing home to prove a point to your children ends up revolutionizing an entire industry.
The next time someone in your life needs care, remember Beatrice Calloway's story. Remember that every elderly person was once someone's baby, someone's hope, someone's future. They've lived full lives, accumulated wisdom, and earned the right to be treated with dignity. And remember that the person you think is powerless might just be the one holding all the cards. What did you think of my story? Have you ever had to navigate the challenges of caring for aging family members? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove you should never underestimate
anyone, because you never know who might just buy the place and become your landlord. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.